Marcus Anderson had never planned on returning to Texas. After spending years consulting for companies on the edge of financial collapse, shuttling between Boston, Chicago, and Phoenix, he had grown accustomed to anonymity, airports, and rooms with revolving thermostats and forgettable art. The idea of stillness had always seemed like a luxury reserved for other people, those who inherited patience, quiet lawns, and childhood homes with creaking staircases. Marcus had none of that. At least not until the letter came. His Uncle Gerald, a man he hadn't seen since he was 17, had passed away, leaving behind a piece of property just outside of Victoria, 20 minutes from the nearest gas station, 30 from the nearest police department. The house came with land, a lot of it. Trees, fences, tool sheds with rusted hinges, and a wraparound porch built when people still did that sort of thing. Marcus didn't hesitate. After years of being a guest in his own life, he was ready to own something that didn't require a client signature or quarterly report. He wanted ground beneath his feet, his own ground. The house was older than it looked in the pictures, but it had good bones. Brick, wood, and a history that clung to the walls like varnish. He arrived on a gray morning in mid-January, the kind where the cold has teeth but doesn't draw blood. The sky was cloudless, the kind that makes silence louder. He stepped out of the rental truck and just stood there for a while, letting the air touch his skin, letting the place introduce itself on its own terms. He hadn't told many people he was moving, just packed what he needed and drove west with the kind of quiet resolve that only hits after too many years of pushing forward without knowing why. The gravel under his boots felt right. The front door stuck when he turned the key, but it gave in with a groan. Inside, it smelled like old pine, dust, and memory. There were still papers on the kitchen counter, notes from Gerald, a man who'd lived alone long enough to write reminders only for himself. Marcus walked from room to room without touching anything. The house had a rhythm, a slow one, and he knew even then that disrupting it would take time. The neighbors didn't come the first day or the second. It wasn't until the end of the week, when Marcus had started pruning the trees out back and cleared the dead leaves from the east fence, that someone finally walked up the driveway. A woman in her 60s, maybe older. She wore a crisp cardigan, white sneakers that hadn't touched mud in years, and carried a tray covered with a folded napkin. Her hair was the kind that took effort, soft waves pinned just so, and her expression was disarming in its confidence. "Welcome," she said before he could introduce himself. "I'm Karen. I live just across the lane, by the white gate with the lanterns. I thought I'd bring something warm." Her smile was wide but measured, the kind that leaves no room for refusal. Marcus nodded, took the tray politely and thanked her, unsure what to do with the sudden domesticity of it all. "It's banana bread," she added, before glancing past him at the house. Gerald was a stubborn man, never wanted to be part of anything. We respected that. But things are different now. Marcus hesitated. Different? How? She shrugged, almost cheerfully. "This community's grown a lot in the past few years. We've made decisions, formalized things. Shared maintenance, neighborhood watch, improvements. It all comes back to shared responsibility." She paused, her gaze settling on him with a quiet firmness. "And land. The land is the anchor of it all." Marcus didn't respond. He thanked her again, stepped back inside, and placed the bread on the counter without unwrapping it. The conversation wasn't unusual on its surface. A friendly neighbor, a welcome gesture. But there was something beneath it. A practiced rhythm, a confidence that assumed agreement. That night, as he sat on the back steps with a mug of coffee and watched the stars edge out from the tree line, he found himself thinking about the way she said responsibility, not as a suggestion, as a given. The second visit came 2 days later. This time, no tray. just an envelope tucked neatly into the screen door as if it belonged there. Marcus opened it standing barefoot in the kitchen. It was a printed packet, formatted like a legal document, though no official seal adorned the top. Just a title: Transitional Use Agreement Proposal, Parcel Integration, Phase 3. The language was dense but not unfamiliar. He'd read enough contracts to know when something was binding and when it was dressed up to look like it. This was the latter. There was a line, highlighted in yellow, stating his voluntary consent to incorporate Parcel 173B into the community reunification boundary as determined by residential committee vote dated October 12th. Below that, a space for his name, signature, and date. No return address, no instructions, just a quiet assumption that he'd sign and comply. He didn't sign it. Instead, he called the county registrar the next morning and asked about any recent filings against his property. The clerk, a tired voice with a tight accent, typed for a while and said there had been no formal encumbrances or liens filed in the last 6 months. When Marcus asked about residential committees or integration zones, the woman chuckled dryly. That sounds like private committee language, not official. Be careful with that. He thanked her and hung up. The next week passed without incident. He finished clearing out the basement, had the septic tank inspected, and even found a local electrician to check the wiring in the back shed. Life began to settle, or at least mimic normalcy. But the silence felt calibrated now, like a held breath. The third encounter didn't happen in person. Marcus was walking the perimeter near the west fence when he noticed something strange. A white marker stake driven into the earth about 2 feet from the boundary line. It wasn't there before. The tag on it read Survey Reference, Segment 4, with a number string and a QR code. The flag fluttered lightly in the breeze, the kind used by development firms, the kind Marcus knew too well. He scanned the code with his phone. It led to a PDF, a document labeled Provisional Grid Overlay, Consolidated Lot Access Map. His land, the lot he inherited, was now part of a phase development buffer zone. Not by law, not by deed, but by paper. By initiative. He took the stake out of the ground. He didn't call anyone. He didn't ask for clarification. That night, someone left a new envelope on his windshield. Same paper. No return address. But this time, the message was shorter. Typed in bold without a greeting. Non-participation jeopardizes collective integrity. Voluntary compliance is the best path forward. Marcus didn't scare easily. Years of sitting across from men twice his age who were about to lose everything had taught him how to hold a stare and not flinch. But this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a negotiation. This was his house, his land, and someone else was drawing lines in the dirt and asking him to pretend they'd always been there. He spent the rest of the night reviewing the deed, pulling archived plats from the county website, and sketching his own map by hand. Not because he doubted the legality, he didn't, but because he needed to see it with his own eyes, needed to touch the lines they wanted him to forget. He went to bed just after 4 a.m. The house was still. No sounds but the creak of settling wood and the faint sigh of wind against the gutters. He dreamed of fences that moved by themselves, of voices outside the window that spoke in committee minutes and anonymous threats. When he woke, the banana bread was gone. Just the empty tray. Left on the porch. Polished clean. He got the first real shift came on a Wednesday morning that was, by all outward measures, entirely unremarkable. Clear skies, a slight breeze from the east, the distant murmur of a chainsaw working somewhere out of sight. Marcus had taken to early routines. Coffee before sunrise. A walk along the perimeter of his property with a notepad in hand, checking for downed branches, noting areas that needed gravel or trimming, But that morning, before he even stepped off the porch, he noticed something new parked across the road. A white pickup with no logo, but a blinking orange light on top, like those used by construction crews or public utilities. Two men stood near the open tailgate. One was holding a rolled blueprint tube, the other was measuring something with a laser rangefinder. They didn't wave. They didn't glance at him. They moved with the deliberate indifference of people who knew they belonged, or at least believed they did. Marcus watched them for a few minutes, then stepped inside and grabbed his phone. He wasn't looking to confront anyone, just to understand. When he stepped back out, the men were gone, the truck driving slowly up the lane and disappearing beyond the bend. In their place, planted into the gravel shoulder, was a rectangular sign. Not metal, not official, but sturdy. White background, red text. Boundary Evaluation Area. Do not disturb, under committee review. No agency seal, no contact number. Just bold letters and a thin red stripe framing the edges like a warning label. Marcus pulled it out of the ground and placed it inside the garage without ceremony. It was the kind of move that felt small but significant. The kind that didn't just reject a sign, it rejected permission. That afternoon, a letter arrived by courier. No return address again, but this time it required a signature. Marcus opened it at the kitchen counter, expecting another veiled threat dressed in committee language, but it wasn't a form. It was a letter, printed, but in human tone. It began with a greeting. Dear Mr. Anderson. That was new. It went on to explain in measured professional cadence that concerns have been raised regarding the future use of Parcel 173B, and that, given the historical relevance of your location within the broader conceptual grid, it would be in his best interest to attend a community intent meeting scheduled for the following Friday. There was no direct threat, no legal pressure, just an invitation that wasn't an invitation. A line near the end made Marcus pause. Absence may be interpreted as non-cooperation with regional planning. The word interpreted did most of the work. He read the letter twice, then placed it face down and sat in silence for a long time. Friday came quicker than expected. The location was listed simply as the Pavilion, a name Marcus didn't recognize, but a quick search online matched it to a weathered community building near the old reservoir, wooden benches, folding chairs, and a string of dusty overhead fans. He debated not going. Part of him wanted to ignore it altogether, but experience told him that silence in situations like these could be weaponized just as easily as aggression. Showing up, he decided, wasn't compliance. It was reconnaissance. He arrived 5 minutes early. The parking lot was half full already. SUVs, sedans, and one aging Volkswagen bus with a peace sign bumper sticker that felt like a strange outlier among the otherwise uniform vehicles. Inside, the atmosphere was both casual and curated. A table offered lemonade and cookies. A laminated agenda hung on a corkboard by the entrance. At the front of the room stood Karen. She wore the same measured smile from their first encounter, but now it felt ceremonial. Her eyes flicked toward Marcus the moment he entered. No nod, no greeting, just quiet acknowledgement. As he took a seat near the back, a man in a collared shirt, mid-50s with the air of someone who chaired too many subcommittees, stood and tapped the microphone. The meeting, as it turned out, had very little to do with community input. There were slides, charts, vague mentions of eco-integration, shared responsibility, and heritage alignment. Words that felt hollow and heavy at the same time. When Parcel 173B came up, Marcus listened closely. Karen presented it herself, referring to his property not by his name, but as the transitional anchor. She spoke of returning the land to cohesive purpose, of correcting isolationist structures that undermine regional cohesion. It wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was rhetorical anesthesia, language designed to lull and disarm. When someone in the room asked if the current occupant had been consulted, Karen replied smoothly, "Dialogue has begun." We're optimistic about resolution. There was applause. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't stand. He left before the final agenda item. Over the next few days, things escalated. Not dramatically, but consistently. His mailbox began receiving duplicate flyers for community development opportunities and voluntary parcel synchronization. One morning, a clipboard was found hanging from his front gate, listing required steps for integration that included a soil sample submission and boundary demarcation coordination. The forms weren't official, but they looked official. They bore seals, newly invented, circular emblems with oak leaves and some Latin phrase he didn't recognize. He took photos of everything, not for evidence, for record. He knew the difference. Then, on the fourth morning, the utilities cut out. No warning, no construction, no city-wide alert. Just silence from the outlets and a blinking thermostat screen. He called the electric company, waited on hold for 40 minutes, then spoke with a woman who sounded exhausted. She asked for his address, then said, "One moment." When she came back, her tone had changed. "I'm sorry, sir. There's an ongoing review associated with your account. We're not authorized to discuss details at this time. You'll need to speak to the coordination committee." He asked which one. She couldn't say. He hung up. He spent the rest of the day powering the house with the backup generator Gerald had left in the shed, wondering if the man had known something like this could happen. That night, the property felt smaller. Not in space, but in certainty. He heard footsteps along the outer fence just before midnight. Not close, not repeated, just one pass. Measured. Intentional. He didn't go outside. He turned off the generator and waited in the dark until morning. The next day, the phone rang at 6:13 a.m. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. No message. It rang again at 6:30. This time he answered. It was a man's voice, level and polite. "Mr. Anderson, we hope you understand the urgency of finalizing your position regarding Parcel 173B. Resistance complicates the schedule. We don't want this to become adversarial. Not everyone gets second chances in these matters. Think carefully." Then a click. Silence. Marcus stood in the kitchen for a long time afterward, holding the phone to his chest, as if expecting it to ring again. But it didn't. He finally went outside, walked the full length of the fence. No new signs, no new flags. Just one thing he hadn't seen before, a single strip of caution tape tied around the base of the oldest oak tree on the north end. It fluttered faintly in the wind, yellow but not bright, faded, like it had been waiting for someone to notice. Something had changed in the air, not a storm or a drop in temperature, but the weight of perception itself. Marcus began to notice the difference not in obvious ways, but in the small friction points of everyday life, the micro-disruptions that accumulated like grains of sand in the gears of normalcy. A local tree removal service he had hired stopped answering his calls. A gravel delivery he scheduled was canceled due to administrative clarification requests. He received a formal-looking letter, again with no official seal, informing him that a temporary freeze had been issued on infrastructure improvements pending resolution of a parcel integration discrepancy. The wording was careful, no direct accusation, no explicit authority, but the message was clear. Activity on his land was no longer solely his decision. There was a growing consensus that he was in the way. The fence at the edge of his western property, a simple line of aging posts and wire, began to take on new features. Colored tags appeared overnight, green, blue, and one bright red, tied to various posts like trail markers for a route he hadn't chosen to walk. He removed them each morning, but they returned the next day, slightly repositioned, as if someone were mapping his resistance like a military tactician, slowly tightening the lines. The most disturbing sign came one evening when he returned from a trip to the supply store and noticed a perfectly coiled rope tucked beneath the porch steps. Nylon, commercial grade, still bearing the inventory sticker. Not threatening in itself, but placed deliberately, an object with no purpose unless it was meant to mean something to him. He left it untouched and reviewed the security footage. 3 figures had approached the property just past the fence line, their outlines blurred by the camera's limited range, their movements slow and synchronized. They didn't enter the house. They didn't break anything. They simply moved like inspectors in a place they already considered theirs. Karen's involvement remained strangely passive, as though she had no need to act now that the tide was shifting in her favor. But her presence became more frequent. He'd see her standing on her lawn, sometimes with a clipboard, sometimes without, always watching. Not him directly, but the land itself. The borders, the markers. On one occasion she stood beside 2 men in matching gray vests. One holding what looked like a soil probe, the other a laser scanner. Marcus stepped outside and walked toward them. Karen turned to him with a smile that was almost sympathetic. "Preliminary mapping," she said casually. "They're not here for you. They're here for the terrain." He didn't respond. The man with the probe gave a quick nod and continued working. No permission asked, no explanation offered. It was the quiet efficiency of people who believed permission was irrelevant when purpose had already been defined. He began receiving nightly calls from unknown numbers. No one spoke. Just silence. Then a click. Then came the anonymous package, left on the rear doorstep, wrapped in butcher paper, sealed with twine. Inside was a collection of topographical overlays, each marked with different zoning stamps and color-coded lot boundaries. His house was highlighted in orange, labeled Neutral Transition Zone, subject to approval. The accompanying note was handwritten, brief, and free of emotion. Adaptive reclamation works best with early alignment. Delay only complicates outcome. He burned the papers in a rusted steel drum behind the shed, watching the maps curl and collapse like brittle leaves, but he kept the note. Not out of fear. Out of curiosity. He wanted to remember how it began. The electricity cut off without warning. He was in the middle of grinding metal for a gate repair when the power dropped, leaving the tool whirring to a dead halt. He checked the breaker, the lines, the generator. Nothing internal. He called the provider. The woman on the other end of the line was polite but distant. There's been a temporary suspension linked to a broader parcel evaluation. We're awaiting confirmation from local coordination entities before service can resume. Marcus asked which entities. She hesitated. That's not information we're authorized to disclose. You may want to check with your residential facilitator. He didn't have a facilitator. He didn't have anyone. He hung up and switched to generator power, rationing it between essentials, knowing they were trying to starve him out. Not by deprivation, but by inconvenience. A siege by red tape and technicalities. He drove to the municipal building, demanded an in-person meeting with someone from Land Services. A clerk took him into a small conference room and reviewed his documents. When he presented the deed, the maps, and his complaint, she nodded slowly and offered a reply that chilled him more than any threat could have. "It's all technically sound, Mr. Anderson, but the environment around you has shifted. When enough stakeholders consolidate a position, even private ownership can become contextual. He asked her to repeat that. She didn't. Instead, she handed him a card with a department contact and wished him a good day. As he left, he noticed a large aerial photo in the hallway, an updated neighborhood plan. His house was on it, labeled pending. Back home, he found his mailbox stuffed with duplicates of prior notices, along with a new one. Thicker paper, embossed crest, and a gold foil strip across the top. Inside was a formal petition listing his property under mandatory integration review, citing his disruptive occupancy as a barrier to geospatial continuity. At the bottom was a line that seemed to pulse on the page. Inaction will be interpreted as passive obstruction. He contacted his attorney. They filed a cease and desist order against further attempts at land manipulation. But legal wheels turned slowly, and whoever was behind this campaign moved with relentless patience. That night, Marcus walked the property with a flashlight and a notepad, marking every new flag, every slight variation in terrain that hadn't been there the day before. At the base of the southern fence, he found a plastic stake with a laminated placard that read, "Final survey access. Clearance pending." He yanked it out, snapped it in half, and tossed it into the trash. The cameras caught movement again near 3:00 a.m. A single figure walking along the eastern boundary, pausing at each corner post, then vanishing into the tree line. They never breached the perimeter. They didn't need to. They knew the message had landed. He no longer felt like the owner of a home, but a guardian of disputed ground. He avoided confrontation, not out of fear, but calculation. These weren't vandals. They were systematized, methodical. He sensed that anything impulsive would be used against him, so he built his defense not with weapons, but with precision. Layers of documentation, time-stamped images. A running log of every incident, every anomaly, every exchange. He wasn't trying to prove his case. He was building the framework to outlast theirs. Then came the first direct approach. A knock at the back door, not the front. He opened it to find a man in a brown jacket, neatly dressed, mid-40s, with a calm demeanor that immediately set off alarm bells. "Mr. Anderson," the man said without introduction, "I represent a facilitation initiative connected to ongoing regional transition planning. We'd like to offer you a structured path to disengagement that benefits all parties." Marcus asked what agency he worked for. The man smiled. "Think of us as logistical harmonizers. We streamline inevitabilities." When Marcus told him to leave, the man nodded respectfully and handed over a sealed envelope. "You don't have to decide today, but I'd suggest reading it before the next boundary installation begins. Things move quicker once staging starts." Marcus didn't open the envelope. He stored it in a locked drawer alongside the others. Not out of indecision, but to document the escalation. He understood now that this wasn't about his house or his compliance. It was about rewriting meaning, redefining ownership as something conditional, subject to vote, pressure, consensus. The house hadn't moved. The land hadn't changed. But the world around it had started to act as though it no longer belonged to him. And the worst part was that no one ever said it outright. They never had to. The tipping point came not with noise or confrontation, but with a letter that arrived in a manila envelope bearing an official state seal. Real this time, embossed and traceable, not a fabrication of some committee or anonymous neighbor's printer. Marcus had it in his hands for nearly an hour before opening it, already anticipating the cold language inside. When he did unfold it, the words confirmed what he'd suspected but hadn't yet believed possible. A motion had been filed in district court regarding his property's status within a Cooperative Reconfiguration Zone, citing a 1973 municipal loophole that allowed regional boards to initiate land use mediation if 2/3 of surrounding residents filed a motion. It wasn't a legal transfer of ownership, not yet, but it opened the door for something dangerously close. What made it worse was the list of names attached, 18 signatures from adjacent properties, some of whom Marcus hadn't even met. They weren't just strangers anymore. They were participants. He forwarded the document to his attorney immediately, who responded in uncharacteristically blunt terms. "This is tactical. It's a shot across the bow, designed to scare you into making a mistake. Don't engage emotionally. Document everything. No direct contact without representation. We'll challenge the validity of the petition, but it's going to take time." Time was a resource Marcus still had, but it was being worn down with precision. Within 48 hours of the court notice, he was visited by 2 city zoning representatives who requested to verify parcel consistency as part of active community planning procedures. They showed IDs, clipboards, and a typed directive. Marcus refused them entry onto the property and handed them a formal notice of non-consent to inspection, which his lawyer had prepared weeks prior. They left without comment, but their exit was slow, reluctant, as if the denial was a delay, not a denial. That night he reviewed the footage again, scrubbing through hours of motion alerts. What struck him wasn't the presence of others, but their absence. The street was busier than it had ever been during the day. Walkers, joggers, dog owners all moving in comfortable patterns. But at night, the entire neighborhood fell into a rehearsed stillness, as if someone had scheduled silence. Even wildlife activity had shifted, or been displaced. The back edge of his property, once home to owls and possums, had gone quiet. The silence wasn't peace. It was control. He tried to test the pattern. He left the porch light on all night. No reaction. He installed a new sensor just beyond the tree line. Something discreet, buried under leaves. The next morning, it was gone, replaced by a small hand-painted rock resting in the exact spot. On it, the words "Do not resurface" were written in black ink, clean lettering, dry to the touch. Marcus kept the rock on his desk beside the unopened envelope from the facilitation agent. He wasn't collecting evidence anymore. He was archiving episodes of a campaign that only grew more intricate with each passing week. The next strategic move came through utility access. A maintenance crew arrived mid-afternoon, claiming to be performing compliance upgrades related to broadband infrastructure. They had no work order, no advance notice. Marcus blocked their entrance, asked for the supervising technician's credentials. The lead worker, young, polite, clearly not used to confrontation, finally admitted they'd been instructed to inspect access corridors for shared routing potential. Marcus documented the exchange, submitted a cease and desist to the service provider, and logged the event with the county. No one responded. That evening, he noticed that several neighboring homes had identical metal plaques installed near their driveways. The plaques featured a minimalistic design, a single leaf above the words "Unified Lot Network." He searched the phrase online and found nothing. No corporate listing, no city department. Yet the design was too deliberate to be random. He walked the street once, counting. 11 houses had them. His did not. The omission wasn't accidental. It was intentional, marked with absence. He returned home and, for the first time in weeks, locked the door from the inside with both deadbolts, as if that gesture would hold back a wave that clearly wasn't going to break through the front, only dissolve everything beneath it. When his lawyer called the next day, the tone was sharper. "They're escalating by implication," he said. Not legally binding yet, but they're creating the framework to argue for functional consensus. They're building an argument that you're the anomaly. Marcus asked if they could stop it. We can slow it down. We can file for injunctive review. But understand, this isn't about whether you own the land. It's about whether you can exercise that ownership without being outmaneuvered socially. They're redefining property not as a legal line, but as a communal agreement. And you're the one person not signing the agreement. The words settled into Marcus like sediment. Heavy, inevitable. The following day, a manila folder was left under his door without knocking. Inside were photocopies of maintenance complaints allegedly filed against him. Unmowed grass, standing water, excessive night lighting, visual obstruction of public view. All fabricated, all dated the same week. His property was well maintained, and the images used as evidence were either outdated or manipulated. Yet the documents were formatted properly, filed under a new initiative code, something called Form 48R, Visual Harm Mitigation. His lawyer confirmed the form was real, though rarely used. The intent was clear. Stack the paperwork until it became a wall. Turn process into punishment. Wear him down not with confrontation, but with bureaucracy. It was brilliant, in a way Marcus had to respect even as it exhausted him. That night, sleep did not come easily. Not out of fear, but because his thoughts no longer belonged solely to him. Every moment he spent in the house, he was aware of the effort it took to stay. Every light switch, every door latch, every time he stepped outside was a quiet act of defiance, not because he was unsafe, but because his continued presence undermined a narrative someone else was trying to finalize. He understood now that his resistance didn't need to be loud to be effective. It only had to be consistent. And, more importantly, it had to be documented, even if no one wanted to look. He began writing notes by hand each evening, detailing events, thoughts, interactions. Not for legal purposes, not for memory, but to hold on to language itself, because when so much of your world is redefined without your consent, the ability to name what is happening becomes an anchor. And that, above all else, he knew they wanted to cut loose. What came next was no longer subtle, no longer wrapped in language crafted to disarm or delay. The second escalation discarded the careful distance that had previously defined the campaign against him and replaced it with proximity, boldness, and an unnerving certainty that the pressure they were applying had moved beyond strategy into something deeper, an ideology. Marcus began to notice that what he had mistaken for bureaucratic maneuvering was now behaving more like a belief system, one that didn't just want his compliance or removal, but his participation in a ritual of surrender. It began with a sound. Not a noise, not a threat, but a sustained tone, low, mechanical, almost subsonic, that started vibrating through the walls of his house late into the night, sometimes just after he turned off the lights, sometimes just as he began to drift into sleep. It was not constant, but it was regular, like a message on repeat. He searched for its source, checked appliances, utilities, even brought in a sound technician under a separate pretense. The technician found no interior cause, but noted that a localized frequency anomaly could result from deliberate low-range emissions. A vague, sterile phrase that meant exactly what Marcus suspected. Someone was targeting his home with sound, not to damage but to wear down, to unmake the idea of rest. By the end of that week, the transformation of his street was nearly complete. Every neighbor now bore the plaque, Unified Lot Network. Some affixed proudly to their fences, others hung like talismans beside mailboxes. What disturbed Marcus was not the symbols themselves, but the behavior of those behind them. Neighbors he had once waved to, nodded at, or exchanged idle pleasantries with no longer acknowledged him. Their eyes didn't meet his. Their dogs no longer barked when he passed. Their sprinklers never misted his side of the road. Everything about their posture had changed. It was not hostility. It was the physical choreography of exclusion, calculated indifference, as if he no longer occupied the same dimension. One afternoon, he passed a woman he had once helped with groceries when her bags tore in the street. She looked through him like a pane of dirty glass. That was the moment he understood they weren't acting under coercion. They believed in what they were doing. The deeper nature of that belief became clearer when a local news circular appeared in his mailbox. It wasn't from a major paper, more of a community digest, printed on rough stock, stapled, and distributed by hand. The cover story was titled, "Land Unification, the Movement Beneath Our Feet," accompanied by a photo of the neighborhood's pavilion. Inside was a 4-page article praising the efforts of the Lot Alignment Initiative and the visionaries behind it, Karen among them. Her quote read, "It's not about forcing anyone. It's about awakening them to what should have always been." That word, awakening, rattled Marcus more than he expected. The article ended with a list of addresses considered pending alignment, with parcel 173B alone in bold. It was not a threat. It was an invitation dressed as finality. That evening, he received an envelope sealed with wax. No note, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a phrase printed in red ink. "There will be a reckoning of silence. The land remembers." He read it 3 times, then set it aflame in the sink. He did not record it. Some things were better left undocumented, not out of fear, but because some messages carried poison in their repetition. His lawyer urged him to consider installing private security, not just cameras. "You're dealing with something systemic now," she said. "They've built infrastructure around belief, and that's harder to dismantle than paperwork." He hired a private firm, not uniformed guards, but former military analysts, low-profile observers trained in behavioral pattern recognition. They set up a mobile command unit in a rented van down the block, rotating staff, changing locations every few nights. The reports they sent back were sobering. Coordinated pedestrian activity at odd hours. Repeated vehicle circuits around his block with no identifiable registration. Visual tracking from multiple points whenever he left the house. Strategic light flashes from neighboring homes, consistent with nonverbal signal patterns. In short, it was no longer paranoia. It was surveillance. Community-backed, ideologically driven, and persistent. The next direct contact was no longer mediated through mail or signs. It came as a visitation. A group of 4 people arrived at his property line just after dusk. Karen among them, flanked by 2 men and a woman, all dressed in matching gray jackets with the now familiar emblem, the stylized leaf. They did not cross the boundary. Instead, they stood in formation just beyond the gate, silent, until Marcus stepped onto the porch. Karen spoke first. "This is the final invitation," she said without raising her voice. "There's a moment in every transition where resistance becomes self-harm. You're at that moment." Marcus didn't answer. One of the men stepped forward, opened a folder, and read aloud. Parcel 173B has been identified as an unresolved unit within a contiguous grid. Unresolved units generate fracture points. Fracture points endanger integrity. Then he closed the folder and stepped back. Karen smiled, not cruelly, but as one does when the outcome is inevitable. "You can still choose to be a part of something larger than yourself," she said, "but not for much longer." They left in silence. The next day, the road outside his house was marked with symbols, chalk lines, numbers, arrows. At first glance it resembled a city utility map. But Marcus knew better. These were designations, tactical overlays. His property had been turned into a live model. He contacted law enforcement, not the local department, but a contact through his attorney with jurisdictional authority. A formal inquiry was initiated. Days later, he received a notification that the inquiry had been referred back to local governance for resolution. That night, a sign appeared on his lawn, staked in deep. It read, "Reintegration Site, awaiting consent." He removed it. The next night, a new one appeared. Consent not required. Final phase pending. That was when the weapon appeared. Not metaphorical. A man stood at the edge of Marcus's property, holding what appeared to be a semi-automatic rifle, visible but pointed downward, held like a symbol, not a tool. He said nothing, just stood for several minutes, then turned and left. Marcus contacted authorities. A patrol arrived 3 hours later, took a statement, and left. No report was filed. The footage was too grainy, the identification uncertain. When Marcus reviewed his own security feed, he found the camera feed had been looped, frozen for 10 minutes, then resumed. Someone had hacked the system. He upgraded everything, wired cameras, hardened perimeter alerts, backup data storage offsite. But he understood the message wasn't about actual violence. It was about posture, psychological displacement, the illusion of inevitability staged so convincingly that it could fracture resolve through suggestion alone. But Marcus had already crossed the point of surrender. His resistance was no longer about reclaiming peace. It was about denying them completion. Every day he stayed, every morning he walked the boundary and pulled their stakes, every hour he documented their choreography. He was creating friction. And friction, even minor, was a form of power. He received no more mail, no more visits, only the silent acknowledgement that he was the fault line now. And, in the ideology of collective reordering, a fault line is sacred, because it reminds those who believe in the grid that even the cleanest lines can crack. There came a moment when the land itself felt different beneath his feet. Not in any physical way, but in the silence that surrounded it. A silence that was no longer the byproduct of distance or rural stillness, but an active force, curated and weaponized by those who had woven their ideology so deeply into the neighborhood that nature itself seemed reluctant to interrupt. Marcus could feel it every time he stepped off the porch, every time he closed a gate or heard the crunch of gravel under his boots. There was a weight to the quiet now, a density that implied surveillance, consequence, and the sense that the ground had become a chessboard. His every move calculated by unseen strategists who were no longer interested in persuasion. They wanted obedience or removal. When the final breach came, it did not arrive through legal summons or another veiled invitation dressed in bureaucratic neutrality. It came as an act, direct and undeniable. Marcus returned from a meeting with his attorney to find his southern fence line completely removed. Posts uprooted, wires coiled and tossed into a neat pile, as if someone had gently dismantled a boundary that no longer held purpose. In its place stood temporary orange netting, the kind used at construction sites, pinned with laminated signs that read, "Pending reassignment, Access Corridor F3. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't miscommunication. It was a calculated encroachment, performed without secrecy and executed with the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing no one will stop you. He called the county again, demanding immediate intervention. He submitted photographs, timestamps, footage from multiple angles. He invoked every clause and code his attorney had armed him with, citing property rights, private land trespass, and unauthorized demolition. The county clerk responded with a neutral tone that chilled him to the core. We've reviewed the materials. Given the status of your parcel in the context of regional planning recommendations, enforcement action would be premature. Premature. The word reverberated in his chest like a gavel. He was still the legal owner of the land. His documents were intact. But the systems that validated that ownership had begun to treat it like an inconvenience, something outdated in conflict with forward motion. And once the mechanisms of authority become passive, illegality becomes a matter of interpretation. He did not sleep that night, not out of fear, but because strategy now demanded clarity, and clarity demanded solitude. He spent the dark hours mapping out every move available to him, every route through the legal terrain, every potential ally still willing to acknowledge the rules. At dawn, he contacted his security team and expanded their coverage to 24-hour rotation. He had the boundary remarked, not with cheap signs, but with industrial-grade steel markers engraved with the exact coordinates of the legal lot lines, bolted into concrete that he poured himself. He placed motion-sensing lights along the perimeter, bright enough to trigger attention but not aggressive enough to provoke. He called his attorney again. "We're filing for injunctive relief at the federal level," she said. "We're bypassing the local system. It won't be fast, but it will be seen." It was the closest thing to hope Marcus had heard in weeks. The response came faster than expected, but not from the court. The next morning, his driveway was blocked by a row of orange cones and a parked SUV with no plates. Two men stood beside it, both in matching uniforms. Gray jackets with a new emblem, not the leaf, but a compass inside a circle. One approached the porch and spoke with a calm precision that masked rehearsed menace. "There's been a report of zoning violation activity on this parcel. You're advised to remain inside while coordination efforts are underway." Marcus replied that they had no jurisdiction. The man smiled without warmth. "Jurisdiction is dynamic. You'll want to consider cooperation. Transitional harmony is our objective." Marcus closed the door without replying. They remained parked for hours. By nightfall, his security team had collected enough footage to assemble a report, detailing not just the men, but the other vehicles that began circling the block in coordinated loops, always moving clockwise, always within the same 10-minute intervals. It wasn't surveillance anymore. It was theater, a demonstration of control, power projected through pattern. His legal filings moved forward. The documents reached the federal circuit, and with it, the first recognition of legitimacy outside his county's boundaries. It was enough to initiate a protective review. Not enforcement, not reversal, but recognition. And that, in this battle, was a seismic shift. 2 days later, a federal investigator arrived, quiet, precise, and deeply concerned. Not by the visible signs, but by the scale of orchestrated exclusion. "They've layered consensus like insulation," the agent said. "Built enough communal agreement to create the illusion of legal pressure. It's harder to challenge because it's not a single violation. It's coordinated ambiguity." Marcus offered everything: files, photos, recordings, logs. The agent nodded, impressed, even unsettled. "You've documented better than half the municipalities I've worked with," he said. "They didn't expect you to keep records. They expected fatigue." That evening, the porch light exploded. No storm, no surge, just a single, deliberate act. The bulb shattered inward, glass scattering across the welcome mat. Security footage showed a figure in a hooded jacket approaching with something in hand, likely a slingshot or small projectile device, then retreating calmly. A note was taped to the doorframe. "Observation has limits. Submission has none." Marcus turned it over to the investigator, who read it twice, then said simply, "They're escalating because you force the system to see them. Word spread, not in the media, not in public, but through channels Marcus couldn't see, federal lines of inquiry that opened up pathways into the tax filings of the Lot Initiative, the zoning records, the documents that had previously been sealed under local discretion. The entire framework that had been used to pressure him began to shift under scrutiny. Investigations widened. Patterns emerged. Donations. Property transfers. An internal review was launched into the origin of the Unified Lot Network and its unauthorized influence on city planning. Then came the withdrawal. Quiet. Sudden. Over the span of 3 days, the cones vanished. The vehicles stopped circling. The signs disappeared. The lights no longer flashed. Neighbors returned to looking at him, not warmly, but without the rehearsed stillness. The pressure had broken, not from confrontation, not from force, but from exposure. The spell had cracked because someone finally looked too closely. Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He reinforced his boundaries, reviewed the new case files, and kept the lights on. The ideology hadn't vanished, but for now it had been displaced. The structure that sought to erase him from his own land had stumbled, not because it was weak, but because he had refused to let his silence be misinterpreted as consent. In a system designed to exhaust, the refusal to vanish became its own kind of victory. When the wind shifted again, it was not with the threat of another siege, but with the unfamiliar weight of quiet that was no longer aggressive. The fences held. The signs stayed down. The calls stopped. Marcus knew better than to assume it was over, not because he feared retaliation, but because he understood systems like this did not simply vanish. They receded, recalibrated, waited. What had once been the front line of his daily life was now a scarred perimeter of quiet victories. The porch had been repaired, the lights rewired, the motion sensors recalibrated. The air around the property felt less like a trap and more like terrain, known, navigable, but never quite safe. There were no apologies, no retractions, no acknowledgments from those who had once stood on his lawn and spoken to him in scripted euphemisms. They simply disappeared behind closed doors and bland expressions, reabsorbed into the community they had helped weaponize. The federal inquiry lingered, slowly turning up inconsistencies in zoning documentation, unreported donations to local officials, and opaque language used to manipulate public records. His parcel, once listed as pending alignment, was removed from all internal planning maps by court order. The legal process was still crawling forward, but the symbolic weight had shifted. Marcus was no longer the outlier. He had become the exception that forced the system to blink. Still, there were traces. Every morning he walked the property line, not for security anymore, but to remind himself that survival wasn't the same as restoration. Some of the steel markers he'd bolted into the earth bore scratches, tool marks from attempts to dislodge them. The grove, near the southern end, still had soil disturbances, narrow tracks from boots that had pressed down more often than they should have. Yet no new signs appeared. No new codes. Just the remnants of a retreating agenda. One afternoon, Marcus received a call from a name he didn't recognize, but a voice that clearly belonged to someone trying not to be recorded. The man said he had once worked as a contractor for one of the facilitation affiliates, hired to conduct terrain mapping under the guise of drainage improvement. "You're not paranoid," the voice said quietly. They had metrics for compliance timelines, behavioral attrition, even psychological profiles. Your name had a notation, non-responsive, prepare pressure escalation. I don't know how you held out. Marcus didn't answer. There was nothing left to say to that. It wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. The house had changed, and so had he. It was no longer an escape or a return to anything. It had become an anchor forged under pressure, not by sentiment or nostalgia, but by choice. He stayed not because it was peaceful. Peace had long since lost its conventional meaning, but because the act of remaining had become a statement stronger than resistance. It was endurance. The community remained largely intact, though different. Karen's house still displayed no lights after sundown. Her car was seen less frequently, her lawn a little less perfect. He heard a rumor she had been removed from the planning board after a series of unrelated procedural violations. No one spoke of the unified lot network anymore. No one used the phrase parcel integration. Those words had been buried beneath a silence they could no longer weaponize. And yet, Marcus did not dismantle his precautions. The cameras stayed. The backups ran. The journals he had kept, documenting every gesture, every breach, every sentence spoken with engineered ambiguity, were now archived, annotated, and secured in 2 separate locations. Not out of fear, but because forgetting would be the final act of surrender. In the end, no apology had been offered, no resolution voted into place, no neighbor stopped by to explain or justify. It ended the way all modern campaigns of control end, not with confession, but with quiet absence. No victor declared, no truth spoken. Just one man who remained standing on his land, not because they let him, but because they couldn't finish what they started. And that, Marcus understood, was all the victory he needed.